Well, thank you all for joining us today on this occasion of book discussion on the book, which is named Crisis and Ontological Security, Serbia's Anxiety over Kosovo Secession. I'm extremely happy to host this discussion on behalf of Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory today. And I'm also very happy that we are finally able to discuss a little bit about this book with Filip and panelists whom I'm going to introduce very soon, because we were negotiating for a long time to have this. It should happen in February, actually, immediately after the Day of Independence in Kosovo. We somehow wanted to schedule the discussion for that day, but it was Sunday, then it was a little bit postponed, and then Corona came. So finally, it's an online event, which gives us a lot of opportunities to have valuable people with us today who can join us from all around the globe, and also to open discussion for wider audience than we could able to do it here if it is happening physically here at the Institute. So Filip, thank you very much for joining us and for accepting to have a discussion on your book. I hope that you are going to have very fruitful outcomes of this discussion, having in mind who is with us today. I would like just to briefly introduce our panelists. So today with us, and I'm going to start with Jelena Subotic, who is coming from United States. We are very closely monitoring what is happening there, following you on Twitter, waiting results in Georgia. So we are really anxious, as Filip would say in his title, of what is going to happen there. But let's hope that things are really going to good direction for the moment. And thank you for joining us. As you might probably know, Jelena is professor of political sciences at Georgia State University in Atlanta. And she's a dear friend who was frequently here also coming, and she's dealing very much with ontological security, and that will be her point discussing today about Filip's book. Then we are going to have Jelena Cupac. I hope I'm pronouncing surname well. She's currently research fellow at the research unit Global Governance at a very prominent vis-à-vis Social Science Center in Berlin, one of the centers where I was always wanting to come. So Jelena, congratulations for the position, and thank you for joining us today. We are going to have then Lea David, who is currently professor at University College Dublin at the School of Sociology. Thank you both, Jelena and Lea, for joining us in midst of teaching and other obligations, and for being able to join us in spite of the time difference. Then I'm also happy to greet a very dear friend who was cooperating with us on another project which was related to Serbian-Albanian relations, Gizim Kresnici, who is greeting us today from University of Edinburgh, when he's teaching for the moment at Sociology Department. I hope not only for the moment, but thank you, Gizim, for accepting the invitation. Then Agon Malici, the person who is coming from Kosovo. We really wanted to have also a true Kosovo perspective here in this discussion, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation. Agon, for those who doesn't know him, is a policy analyst, activist, and also media writer, and he is one of co-founding editor at S-Banker.net, which is a blog which is actually gathering young generation of academics, civil society, activists, think tankers, and basically active citizens. And that is something which is very, very much in the line of what Institute is trying to do here. So I think you're doing a very great job, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, evening. And finally, two of my colleagues from the Institute, one of them who was coordinating together with me the project about Serbian-Albanian relations, that's Sasha, or Alexander Pavlovic, who is hiding behind his black window with a name, and probably will join us later because he's He is joining us from his home with kids. So thank you, Sasha, for also helping me organize this event tonight. And Vladimir Cvetkovic, another person who is coming from the Institute, who is currently sitting in Germany, but is working with us as a research fellow, actually for the moment, senior research fellow. Thank you for joining us also tonight. So basically, I would like to give a floor in the beginning to Filip to give us few insights, what you think would be interesting for us to hear in the beginning. And then I would like to go with this order, which I was presenting the people, to give you the space in 5-7 minutes to give a comment or a question. And I hope we are going to be able also to allow our attendees to join us. For the moment, we have 52 attendees, which I find quite interesting and stimulating for discussion. And I hope we are going to have some space to accept the questions also from this group of people. But Filip, the floor is yours now.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Gazela. Thank you for this very kind introduction. It's really a great pleasure to have this opportunity today to discuss my book with such a distinguished panel and at the EFDT event, which I'm particularly happy because at the beginning of my PhD project, it was probably the first presentation which I gave was at one of the conferences of EFDT. So now it's the second opportunity, actually, after a decade or so, for me to reflect back on my PhD project and on the book, and also hear your thoughts and views on them. And I also especially thank you for organizing this event, and also for this great crowd of people who decided to abandon other activities, most of them probably much more exciting than this one, to participate in this discussion. And one of them certainly being to follow the nail-biting finish of the vote count in the US presidential elections. So the book which will be discussed today, as I said, originates in my PhD thesis, which I defended at the Faculty of Political Science back in 2012. And the book is a slightly kind of revised version of my PhD, and obviously summarized version. The main motivation which moved my project from the very beginning was mostly political and empirical rather than theoretical. It was to understand Serbia's obsession with Kosovo and all things Kosovo, the idea and the territory. When I was starting my PhD in 2008 or 9, I was really struck by the disproportionality between the huge amount of political energy invested by several generations of Serbian political elites in the so-called defense of Kosovo on the one hand, and the scarcity of critical works by political and other social scientists in Serbia on the subject matter on the other. One was really hard-pressed to find good books critical books about Serbia's Kosovo policy. So the key puzzle which I was trying to solve in my research project was to understand why Serbia has pursued not only aggressive, but also self-harming and therefore seemingly irrational policies vis-à-vis Kosovo over the past 30 years or so. Serbia's Kosovo policy in the late 80s accelerated the Yugoslav disintegration. Serbia's policy vis-à-vis Kosovo in the 1990s led not only to civil war, but also NATO intervention in 1999. And most puzzlingly of all, after the fall of Slobodan Milosevic in 2000, instead of gradually coming to terms with the loss of Kosovo, Serbia continued to pursue counter-secessionist policies without a clear or realistic strategy, hence incurring huge political, economical, and reputational cost. And to understand why Serbia has acted in this way, I drew upon ontological security theory, or as some scholars like to put, ontological security studies in international relations. The basic premise of this theory, which was first developed within social psychology and then traveled to political science and IR, is that states, just like individuals, are often ready to sacrifice their physical security and material interests in order to maintain their self-identity needs, their biographical continuity, and a sense of emotional calm. Moreover, by taking cues from the work of Anthony Giddens and a bunch of other scholars, I have further developed this theory in two ways. My first contribution has been to analytically develop the concept of critical situations in world politics that make states ontologically insecure in the first place. And I propose that critical situations can be identified through a public outburst of fundamental questions related to existence, relation, biography, and finitude. Secondly, I developed a concept of ontic spaces, material environments discursively incorporated into the project of the self, aimed at stabilizing its essentially unstable, fragmentary, and fluid nature. The key empirical argument which I make in the book is that although Serbia's policy may seem irrational to an outsider, it can be understood as an honor-driven ontological self-help. In other words, Serbia's rigid attachment to all things Kosovo is an attempt to fend off existential anxieties and the associated feelings of humiliation and shame, which are stemming from the prospect of accepting the loss of a territory which has been construed as the national ontic space since the late 19th century. Finally, and with this I will finish, I have tried in the book to avoid the dominant nationalist and primordialist understanding of Serbia's emotional attachment to Kosovo as something which has existed from time immemorial and which is totally normal and unquestionable. However, I have also abandoned a liberal and modernist myopia, which reduces national identity to a set of deceitful discourses which are fully in control of ethnopolitical entrepreneurs and which can be easily discarded and overcome. To paraphrase Karl Marx, Serbian elites make the Kosovo policies, but they don't make them under the circumstances of their own choosing. The collective discourses related to Kosovo have long sedimented in the Serbian society, and they cannot be wished away overnight. Their adaptation, in my view, requires not only a proper understanding of their deep-seated emotional appeal, which I've tried to do in my book, but also a transgenerational political labor to define who we are and who we want to be as a nation. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take all the questions after the panelists.
Thanks a lot, Filip, for introducing the core ideas of your book. I was just thinking when you said there is no strategy in what has been done by Serbian policy actors. I'm thinking there is no strategy in anything which which has been done, but we are going to leave that for the end. I would now like to invite Jelena for the first comment, and in general I would like to invite you in pairs, so Jelena and Jelena would be first two person who will give their comments and questions, and then I will give you floor to answer them. So Jelena Subotic.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, and thank you so much for inviting me. It's really wonderful to be able to finally talk about this book, about which I've known from its very beginning and read many early drafts, and as everybody knows, worked very closely with Filip on a lot of other projects and learned basically everything I know about Kosovo policy from Filip. So I feel really honored to be able to say a few things about it. I also want to apologize for having to probably leave before the end of the panel because I have another conference. All of this while I'm trying to refresh my vote count in my own county. And so it's a very ontologically insecure day and very anxiety. The anxiety level is off the charts. So I'll be probably a little bit more frazzled than even usually. So I want to make two theoretical points to keep the discussion focused and then let others add. And I want to talk about really the two contributions that Filip's book makes to IR theory more broadly, but especially to ontological security. And they're both very important and, in my view, will have very long-lasting implications for ontological security scholarship more broadly, much more broadly than the study of Serbia and Kosovo. So the first contribution, in my view, is the how Filip conceptualizes what is a crisis. And I think that's really important because in the book, he talks about how if we understand actors as having ontological insecurity about their world and what surrounds them, then the moment of crisis is especially going to be the moment where all of those insecurities and anxieties would come to the fore. And so you can imagine that in your everyday life, you think your life is going a certain way, you have routines, you have practices, you have habits, and then a crisis occurs. And then that crisis puts everything in question and questions what you thought your stable expectation of your life was. And in the case of states, what you thought of yourself and what you thought of your identity. But I think what Filip does in the book also is explain that this crisis may be in many ways a crisis of your own making. So for observers and outsiders, this does not look like a crisis because it's something that can be negotiated or something that can be dealt with or something that doesn't seem like such a big deal. But that is irrelevant as long as it's a fundamental crisis for your own self and for your own sense of identity. So what does it mean to have a crisis of who you think you are and what you think your place in the world is a much more as existential crisis, if you will, than something that we can observe as a crisis in a regular setting that for outsiders may not seem like such a big deal. And that's important, obviously, for the case of Kosovo, because all of us in this call probably had at some point had to explain to outsiders, what's the big deal? Like, just what's the big deal? Just give it up. What's the big deal? And of course, as Filip explains, it is a big deal, and it's a big deal because of what that does to Serbia's sense of who it is and what it is, and not a big deal economically, really, and probably not even politically. The second point that I want to make is the concept of ontic spaces, or this relationship between material environment and a sense of security, especially in international relations as it relates to states. And this, I think, is a really a big leap forward in international relations theorizing, especially when it comes to ontological security, because as Filip mentioned, and as his book discusses at length, the point of ontological security arguments is that states, just like individual people, don't just worry about their physical material security. You worry about your sense of security of who you are. But what Filip does in the book and in some of his other articles and other work beyond the book is to say, but wait, we should bring material environments back to our understanding of ontological security, but think about it differently. So how can we think about material environments such as territories, buildings, cultural heritage projects, monuments? How can we think of those very material things not mattering for their materiality, but for what they do to that identity, ontological sense of who we are? So when Serbs look at monasteries, it's not the monasteries that in Kosovo that they care about. It's what the monasteries in Kosovo tell them about Serbia's role in the world, Serbia's role in the world in the past, Serbia's medieval past, Serbia's center of a particular kind of post-Byzantium fantasy, and all of that. So it's not the building itself, as everybody knows. Very few Serbian citizens have ever been to Kosovo. Very few of them have ever been to any of those monasteries. Very few of them could be able to pick which one of it is, which one is Dečani, which one is Gračanica. That doesn't matter. It's what those monasteries represent to the sense of Serbian as identity. And I think this idea of how materiality and in physical environment matters for identity and for sense of your own self has a very long shelf life, if you will, in international relations, and I think can be really applied. I mean, I'm applying it. I'm writing about something completely different and applying Filip's ideas. And I think many other people will. I will say just one more thing. I don't want to go over time. Just to respond to what Filip himself said, how he's trying to understand nationalism in a different way. And I think another contribution of this book is also to talk about how even though the book is about Serbia and its relationship to Kosovo, it also talks, it gives us a sense how it not only is Serbia not unique and special, but his framework can be applied to many, many other states and help us understand how many other states feel about this indivisible territory and material environment as well. And I'm done, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jelena. Now, Jelena, another Jelena.
Good evening, everybody, or good day, depending where you are. I'd also like to thank Gisela for calling me to participate in this event. I really thoroughly enjoyed this book, but it did also cause me a lot of anxiety. So I enjoyed it, obviously, for the quality of the argument that Filip puts forth in it. It's really wonderfully written. The argument is very clear, it's accessible. But it did take me on a trip through Serbian history, through this relationship with Kosovo. And I did feel anxious about it because it showed to me that little changes even when it changes. And then I was thinking, well, how can I square this sense of things changing, but not really changing with your conceptualization of anxiety? And rather than kind of praising your approach to anxiety, I landed more on the side of maybe challenging it. So here is my line of challenge. So Filip, I fully agree with you that states as corporate agents have a need for ontological security. I also fully agree with the sequence you present. So I do think that be it individual or corporate agents, if they are able to keep at bay those four existential questions, they are essentially in the space of ontological security. If there is a rupture, they're likely to have to deal with these existential questions, causing them a lot of anxiety, and then the need to resolve this through some new routine. While I think this is true for some situation, I actually disagree that engaging with these four existential questions will necessarily induce paralyzing anxiety, because I think that's how you conceptualize it. You say, especially for Serbian actors, it did the recognition or the unilateral declaration of the Kosovo independence did generate a paralyzing sense of anxiety in Serbian political elites. The reason I think there is not such necessity is that in this process of constructing and satisfying the need of states for ontological security, we have to be aware that there is a political process underneath that actually drives it. And in this political process, political agents have to both satisfy the ontological need of their states and of their polity, but they're also instrumental agents that want to keep power. So they have this conundrum, they have to resolve it in some way. And because they have to cling to power somehow, I don't think that anxiety for them is always paralyzing. Rather, in certain situations, it can be very, very useful. It's a useful tool, and we know this from various other theories. It's a useful tool for mobilizing people. It's a useful way of legitimizing the power, essentially. So in that sense, again, I don't think that anxiety is a necessarily paralyzing force, but can actually open a space for more agency for certain agents. Which now brings me to another point, and that's the idea that if this is a sort of routinized mode of operandi, if political agents perpetually produce anxiety, so the anxiety does not come to them necessarily from the outside, then this can become a known context. This can become a situation where anxiety is actually giving these agents an ontological security. They just know how to swim in this context very nicely, as we know. Which brings me to the treatment, or to your treatment of Kosovo, where I was a little bit dissatisfied with the way you present this historical narrative of how Kosovo became an ontological or ontic space for Serbia. And then anxiety is decoupled from that. And as if it becomes this space through historical process, but then if it's taken or if it's attacked, that's when anxiety is triggered. But I would challenge that. I think that the very construction of Kosovo as an ontic space is done through the production and reproduction of anxiety. So in that sense, I would like to put forth maybe a kind of bold, but not very revolutionary hypothesis, but maybe a bit bolder. And I read your work differently from it. I would argue that the only way that Kosovo can feature as an ontic space constitutive of Serbian identity is by it never actually belonging to Serbia or never fully belonging to Serbia. So in order for Kosovo to act as an identity creating things, it always has to be within reach or not fully in Serbian hands. So there always has to be this anxiety about it. It's this perpetual drama of trying to gain it, then losing it, that there is some betrayal and so forth. And I think that's where, in this perpetual anxiety, that's where actually ontological security of both Serbian political elites, but also of Serbian polity is. So if I think about Serbian polity or Serb or an average Serb, I would say that this is how they actually know Kosovo. So this is a cognitively and emotionally familiar story about Kosovo, and hence it is a story that gives them ontological security. A perverted way or perverted kind of ontological security, but ontological security nonetheless. So Serbs have never known Kosovo as a space of possession. They have always known it as a space that is attacked by Turks, by Albanians, by the international community. And only through this drama, they always can say, yeah, that is the cradle, that is the ontic space, that is how we are becoming Serbs. And I would also argue that this is how Serbia constructs its relationship and even ontological security with the wider international community. I think throughout the book, you speak about this Serbia's desire to belong to the international society of states. But I think that there as well, there is this need of not really belonging. I think that Serbia really does not know cognitively and ontologically what it means to belong. It's the more familiar narrative, if you like, is not belonging, is being perpetually attacked. So again, this anxiety that is so familiar that both people can understand it much better, but also it's the space within, I think, our political elites know how to behave better than in maybe some normal context of ontological security. And this same argument I would extend again to political elites, because there is a level of instrumentality that they need with respect to Kosovo. Again, I would say that not having Kosovo is much better for them in terms of identity, because by not having Kosovo, they can actually assert their Serbian identity much stronger. And they can come out as those who are defending Kosovo. If they had it, Kosovo would lose this power, arguably lose this power, because it would have to be constructed in some different way. So that would be a kind of my challenge to your argument. This idea that if we deal, or if the polity deals with those four existential questions from the Giddens, I don't think that they necessarily need to be paralyzing, but that can actually be an instrument for the construction of an ontological security and for agency to proceed the way this agent always knew. And in that sense, again, I would not criticize your entire book after finishing it and after putting my argument together. I've decided that your approach is almost normative. And how I think this, I think you're very optimistic with respect to Serbia as an agent. And I think you see it more as a sort of adaptive ontological security agent. Whereas the picture that I've just presented is a picture of a maladaptive ontological security seeking agent. So there is this routinized ontological attachment to a conflict. So this need of the perpetual drama. And I would really like to hear your opinion on this approach. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really interesting to hear both of you. And now I'm particularly looking for what Filip will answer. So Filip.
Especially the ones which are critical, because
you were muted, so please just repeat.
So thanks both for really, really thought-provoking comments and questions, both those which have praised my work and those which critically engaged with it. And I find especially useful the latter. I'm not criticizing you, Jelena, the first, but I'm just really expressing my appreciation for the critical comments also by Jelena Cupic, because this is why we are in this business. The worst thing that can happen to you is that everybody is tapping you on the back and telling you how great you are without ever letting you know what challenges are faced with your book. So let me just pick up on a few things which Jelena Cupic has mentioned. First of all, the 4 questions and whether we can conceptualize critical situations through the 4 questions, and whether the outburst of the 4 questions actually paralyze actors or create maybe more space for some creative or destructive agency, if you will. While I fully agree with you that, I mean, anxiety can open up space for new agency, there needs to be one step in between, which is the production of fear. Anxiety is a great fuel, if you will, because it creates a lot of unease among the people and among the elites. It could be paralyzing if nothing is done, because politicians cannot really easily control anxiety. Anxiety is this deep sense of uncertainty over the future. So what you need in order to create some controllable agency is to basically transform anxiety into fear, into particular objects which are threatening the nation and the self. And if you succeed in this alchemy of politics, if you will, kind of identifying threats which are manageable to the nation, if you transform anxiety into fear, and if you find new routines which shield the population and provide the protective cocoon against those manageable threats to the nation or to the individual, then you create a very kind of controllable space and agency. Then you can easily steer the nation and create the agency that you wanted as political elite. What I argue in the book is that the 2008, although the crisis has started obviously with the first cracks in the Yugoslav order, the anxiety started kind of bursting, first at some kind of low intensity level. It was transformed into the fear of the neighbors, fear of the Croats, fear of the KLAs, and it was controllable. But then since 2000, due to desecuritization and deconstruction of objects of fear because of democratic transition and Europeanization of the state, once Kosovo declared unilaterally independence, anxiety was fully blown in the open without those manageable objects of fear that politicians could easily grasp and create a space for agency. This is why Serbia, in my view, in 2008 was really a paralyzed state. We really didn't know whether we are going to, Russia, West, the European Union, Kosovo. I mean, the country seemed to be totally lost. There was so much discussion about the schizophrenia of the country, strategic disorientation. People didn't really know what is the strategic kind of goal of the country, where are we heading at. But then slowly but surely the political elites have created those new narratives and those new vows. We will never ever recognize Kosovo. This is our kind of word. And as long as Serbia exists and the last Serb on this planet, we will remain committed to this almost new Vidovdansky kind of, wow, we have a new mission in the world. We will wait for 2000 years if need be, before we return to the sacred ground of Kosovo. And there, I'm moving to the second question just briefly. You're totally right. I mean, Kosovo doesn't need to be incorporated physically into Serbia in order to act as an ontic space. On the contrary, I mean, Kosovo, and I'm trying to explain this in the book, from the very beginning had two master narratives attached to it. One was that Kosovo is the cradle of the nation, spirituality. It kind of generates the feeling of pride, of great medieval history, Tsar Dusan, and everything else, monasteries. But then another narrative, if you will, the dark side of this story, of this script, was that Kosovo is the tomb of the Serbian nation. Throughout the Middle Ages, in folk songs and other kind of collective memory, but also especially in the 19th century, Kosovo became a symbol of the tomb of the Serbian nation, which Serbia descended into with the Battle of Kosovo, but then it's the tomb from which the Serbian phoenix will arise again with the Reconquista, with the the Balkan Wars, and with the rejuvenation of the national pride and the new golden age, if you will. So these two narratives of Kosovo as a tomb and Kosovo as the cradle are, constitutive in the Kosovo narrative, and one without the other doesn't really work. And the more you have signs that Kosovo is becoming the tomb again, the more you feel anxious, right? But it also feeds into this idea that this is like a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is a confirmation of the whole narrative of Kosovo. But on the other hand, and with this I'll finish, I really think that if, few decades pass, just like in Karelia in Finland and in many other cases, this narrative can change, and the elements of the narrative, especially the tomb part of the narrative, can slowly wither away. But it really requires a very intensive discursive labor. It needs to involve not only the liberal intellectuals from the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory and Faculty of Political Science. It has to bring on board those ones who define the narratives of who we are. It's the Serbian Orthodox Church, it's the national intelligentsia, it's the SANU, it's artists, it's basically a wide array of people who have to redefine the narrative so that it kind of ditches this anxiety-producing metaphor of Kosovo as the tomb. Because yes, Serbia can live without Kosovo, and it can still remember the golden age and cherish the memories of medieval greatness.
Thank you, Filip. Thank you very much. Now we are continuing with Lea.
Okay, hi, welcome. I have no idea why do I look like a Smurf on this screen, but it is what it is. I want to start with Norbert Elias, a German sociologist who claimed that nations, just as individuals, have biographies, arguing for the central place of the power of beliefs, ideals, and values in day-to-day politics. And according to this approach, the notion state is understood as a bounded community constituted by a biographic narrative which gives meaning to its collective being. Again, according to Elias, ideally nations manage to fulfill the aspirations to align their biographies with their political action in the course of their histories. Yet for those nations that need to acknowledge weaknesses and inferiority, this task may become very burdensome. And this is precisely where Ejdus research is situated. What happens where there's a gap between the state self-perception and the reality on the ground? How states overcome those tensions? So to bridge this gap between national biographies and the ongoing political action, one can turn, as Filip does, to the theory of ontological security. Ontological security or insecurity is one of those theories that tend to polarize the research community. Either you accept it or you reject it. And this is because its starting point is grounded in this anthropomorphic perception of the state, meaning the belief that states do have feelings, which is a point of contestations for many. However, and regardless on what side of this equation anyone of you is,
there's at least two aspects of this book that are, in my opinion, really, truly brilliant. So first aspect has to do with this meticulous, almost microscopic ethnographic account on the Serbian-Kosovo relationship throughout the history. I think that the Ejdus account of the Serbian side of the meaning-making processes engraved through political discourses and actions are remarkable, and it is truly a mastery to everyone and anyone dealing with the contested relations between Serbia and Kosovo. On that account, it would be very interesting to see what sort of biographic narrative, to use Filip's vocabulary, Kosovo is trying to maintain. Second aspect, which I want to address in further detail, is bringing emotions to the front of the research in international relations. Emotions are traditionally regarded as soft power, and their impact on political behaviors is largely neglected and under-researched. Most closely, Ejdus argues that states' biography is tightly linked to emotions that operates as motivational system to bridge the gap between the desired identity and the challenges posed on the ground. Here, I wish to turn our attention to the ways we understand emotions and to pose some questions and address some challenges, this junction between the national biography, the role of emotions, and the ways in which day-to-day politics operates brings to the fore. So sociology of emotions brings a number of different ways and classifying systems through which we can analyze emotions. The most basic distinction is to primary and secondary emotions, where primary emotions are considered to be universal, psychological, biologically and neurologically innate, while secondary emotions such as guilt, shame, love, resentment, pride are socially and culturally conditioned, and this is very important for this research. So what matters to our discussion is the fact that feelings emerge in specific social situations. So understanding an emotion means understanding the situation and social relation that produces it. In other words, when we talk about emotions, we're actually talking about the patterns or relationship which link the self with its environment and with others. Now, I wanted briefly to mention 5 different theoretical approaches to study of emotions, but I will go beyond that because I want to get to my points. So in any case, in this sense, it is very informative to see American sociologist Charles Horton Cooley's theory of the looking glass self from the beginning of the last century that argues that we always see and evaluate ourselves from an external perspective. The basic mechanism means evolves 3 steps. First is imagining how we appear to the other. Second is imagining how the other judges our appearance. And the final step is a response based on what we think of this judgment in the form of a feeling such as pride or shame, for example. Hence, just as Durkheim argued in the elementary forms of religious life, groups, collective and socially shared emotions do exist. And individual experiences and expressed group emotions and collective emotions exist because they create a certain membership in the group. In short, so we can state that what we feel in a social situation will depend on the content and the outcome of the interaction, the balance between what we obtain from this exchange, the type of social relationship that connects us with the other, the relevant norms and values, and a broad set of other social factors. So here, Filip argues that emotions such as fear, anger, and in particular anxiety, but also shame and pride, are the key motivators for re-establishing the continuity of the Serbian national biography. The sociological importance given to fear and anger on the one hand and shame and pride on the other are explained not so much by their importance in individual psychic lives, but by the fundamental role they play in social structures and in social dynamics. Now, even if we accept this position of a culturally or nationally specific emotional climates or emotional cultures that are deeply embedded in national past and habitus, which I personally do, the jump from there to the role of emotions as the main driver in any state political life, for me, is not an easy one. So I want to ask here three main questions that rise from this, I would say, alignment between the state, the role of emotions, and political action. First of all, what is then this entity called state? I mean, state is not one thing. Or if you even use this anthropomorphic speech, or I would rather use zoomorphic speech, state is more of an octopus with multiple tentacles and multiple simultaneous narratives to be maintained. And though Ejdus, I have to say, masterfully sketches emotional complexities by which the Serbian state is guided, applying one set of emotions, such as anxiety, at any given time seems very dubious to me. Second, I see great potential in the approach that states need to maintain a continuous national narrative. However, as we know it from narrative research, for example, narrative is always about how one tells their own story. This means that those narratives are always framed to portray certain worldview by selecting certain fragments and elements to fit this picture. In other words, every single political action, no matter how inconsistent or shocking can it be, and it is always fragmented to fit and framed to fit certain narrative. Okay, until now, I think Filip and I see things eye to eye. But what bothers me here is the following. If any and every action can be repacked to sit more or less comfortably with the national biographic narrative, then there is no real meaning to narrative. There is just bare politics. In other words, every political action can be narrated. This means that there is no steady linear biographic narrative to follow, just really narrowed politics of opportunism. And third question, the reading of the Serbian-Kosovo relations offered by Filip is remarkable. However, I wonder whether the state actions with regard to Kosovo are motivated by the need to maintain biological narrative of the state, or are in fact a manipulative force to actually forge emotions of fear, anxiety, or pride on the ground. In other words, an alternative reading of those relations can be a reverse one. The Serbia's political, intellectual, religious elites are manipulating, instrumentalizing, and harvesting those emotions to promote certain, often narrow political agendas in the struggle for, let's say, a voting electorate or any other specific agendas. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Yes, I just want to ask Filip now, because there were three questions and there was a longish comment. Would you like maybe to respond now and then to give floor to Gezim, or?
Yeah, I'm happy to respond. To pretend once again that I have the answers to all the questions. I mean, thank you very much, Lea. I mean, just like with the previous two comments, I certainly have to think about everything you've said more thoroughly before I give my final word, because you raised really, like the other Jelena's, extremely difficult and important points. One is the relationship between kind of emotions and states and world politics. You know, emotions have long been totally ignored in international relations research. And even though realists get away all the time with their references to fear and the survival of states, when you try to understand some other emotions, all of a sudden you are talking about epiphenomenal things about emotions. Who care about emotions? World politics is all about interests. States are interest motivated motivated entities. And just as much fear is important, I think other emotions such as anxiety, but also many others which the emotional turn in IR has covered or started covering are relevant too. And you're totally agree. I mean, I focus mostly on anxiety and also on its evil twin sister fear, so to speak, because they're difficult to separate, and the relationship between anxiety and fear in ontological security studies is extremely important, because it is through the identification of objects of fear that political elites and states try to alleviate anxiety. So they're like really mutually constitutive, if you will. But I've indeed neglected many other emotions that I could just as well study. For instance, honor I mention in passing, but I never really, unpack it properly. Or humiliation. Humiliation is an extremely important emotion, which is related to anxiety, but it's a different story. And many others that I could study, and I simply had to make an analytical choice and zoom my analysis, because the whole analysis would be too kind of bulky and complicated. There would be too many moving parts. So I had to make this analytical choice, which is impoverishing, but on the other hand, allows my story to hang, hopefully, as one relatively coherent story. What is a state? I mean, this is, a never-ending question, which really is you hit the nail there. It's one of the most difficult questions. How do we define the state? Is the state only the government, or the state is all three branches of government, or within the state we also cover all other actors which are basically instrumentalized one way or another by the state, or which co-opt the state into its own agendas, from the church through political parties, so on and so forth. My take in the book is quite narrow. I understand state as either the narrative about the nation, and political elites in office who manipulate, who do something with this narrative, who try to defend it and have actions to kind of alleviate anxiety from attacks on that narrative. I know it's, again, it's a choice which has its downsides, but it was easier for me in order to, narrow down the list of actors whose discourses I'm going to study. Because if I was to cast my, net much more widely, then I would really have to, especially in the core chapters of the book, which is the, from 2000 onwards book, I would have to study how the intellectuals are narrating Kosovo, and how in arts, in poetry, in opposition, marginal discourses, because as you're totally right, I mean, this is another weakness, if you will, of the book, but I've intentionally made this choice. I focused only on the dominant narrative. And since David Campbell's book on writing security, I mean, criticisms have been leveled on that sort of analysis, which is focusing only on the dominant narrative, which is kind of ignoring or sidelining myriad other marginal alternative discourses, which challenge from both left and right, and from outside and inside the dominant storyline. But I had to make this choice in order to say a coherent story within some, parameters of a book or a PhD. So I made this choice, consciously to, focus on the dominant script, which is in the hands of the ones who are in the government and of the national elites, right, of the nationalist intelligentsia. And finally, the question is whether politicians are, another extremely difficult question is whether politicians are really defending the biographical narrative, or they're just instrumentalizing those opportunities. And as Jelena Cupac has suggested, they're just playing with this anxiety and turning it into their own kind of maneuvers and goals. I truly kind of believe, and I try to argue it in the book, is that there is a sedimented, there is a narrative. I could consider the story about the Kosovo as a sedimented structure. It's not permanent, fixed, but it's not easily. It's not plastic, if you will. It's not easily manipulable. Now, I understand that even Jelena Subotic in her article in Foreign Policy Analysis shows how this narrative can be adapted. And she's maybe closer to your side of the interpretation. I see it as a relatively fixed, and I try to show in the book that elements of the Kosovo story, as somebody has identified at the very beginning, I think Gazela, the elements are remarkably similar throughout this long period. I mean, Kosovo is a tomb and Kosovo as the cradle. Kosovo is a sacred space, is a holy land. Kosovo as a place where, the nation is existentially threatened, but also the place where the nation can flourish and revive, if you will, at some point. I think that it's not, although politicians try to instrumentalize it, it's not so easy. And two examples. One example is Boris Tadic, whom I interviewed, and I shared the insights in the book. He himself, although maybe was educated in a certain family which was closer to this conservative ideology, himself was not the epitome of a conservative politician, right? He was the president of DS, and he was talking to a constituency which was more forward-looking and in favor of the European Union. And nevertheless, once Kosovo declared independence, he found himself like in a cage. Like he couldn't really, the range of legitimate options that he had at the disposal was shrunk. He had this feeling that he has to defend identity, or he will simply, be defeated politically. He didn't see a way out of simply this regressive attachment to the nationalist or conservative or mythological even narrative, if you will. Aleksandar Vučić is the second example. He is one of those politicians who was propagating and propelling the nationalist narratives in the 1990s. Then he changed a little bit. He moderated his approach to politics, and he tried to open a rationalist discussion during the so-called internal dialogue. But then he faced a very strong, very strong resistance from society. Now, this resistance was partly also of his own making, because his tabloids continued to propel the nationalist storylines, and that is the question for him, probably why. But on the other hand, it was not only the tabloids. Take a look at the opposition, the church. I mean, everybody coalesced on the right, waiting for him to make a concession over Kosovo, to attack him. Even the intellectuals and politicians whom you didn't expect to do it, like the entire alliance for Serbia and the opposition is basically criticizing Vučić for being a traitor and for selling out Kosovo. So with him, you also see that, even though he tried to manipulate and to adapt the narrative, he failed. Why? Well, I argue because there is this sedimented structure, the narrative on Kosovo, which is not of their own making. They can try to play with it, but the range of options is limited.
Thank you, Filip, for this comprehensive answer. Now we move to Gizim for his comment.
Well, thanks a lot. First of all, Gazela, for inviting me to be part of such a wonderful panel of people. I've met some of the people on the panel and I haven't met the others. So hello, everyone. It's really great to be here. And also for giving me the opportunity to comment on what I think is a brilliant book. So I've read one or two articles before by Filip, but I truly think this is a great book. And I would want to congratulate Filip on writing such a great book, which I think is probably the best book that I'm aware of that really explains this obsession in Serbia with the Kosovo issue. There are so many different interpretations about what Kosovo means to Serbia today and how central Kosovo is in the understanding of the contemporary Serb nationalist narratives. But I think I can't think of any other book which really does a really meticulous job to really explaining the origins, the development, but also the current way that the Kosovo myth has in the Serb national discourse, but also in the Serbian everyday politics in more general. So I'll try to offer some kind of general points about the relevance of the book to nationalism studies, because of course this is a politics/IR kind of approach, but it's also a nationalist study because the themes are mostly like the themes that the book engages with are quite central to nationalism studies. So I think in many ways, although not directly, or at least not always, the book also engages with two fundamental questions in nationalism studies. The first one is, when is the nation? So the history of the nation, the emergence of the nation, the idea of the nation, but also the development of the narrative about the nation. And the second one is, where is the nation? So the idea of territory, its boundaries, its limits, or whether the nation is in flux or whether its borders are more stable or not. And I think Filip does a great job in trying to address these questions by adopting a number of tools from sociology and politics and IR on the other hand. So it's very multidisciplinary. It's a bit eclectic as well in many ways because it operates with a number of tools, but I think all of them fit very nicely together. If you take some of the critical themes in the book, such as the issue of anxiety, I think it's very nicely connected to the idea of the limits of the nation, not only in terms of the historical trajectory of the nation, but also the territorial limitation or lack of clear boundaries that the nation has. And I think probably one of the critical things here, which is not always very salient in the study, is the fact that anxiety also comes from this state of insecurity because of unclear territorial boundaries. If we look at the emergence of this first Serbian polity, first Serbian modern polity, it was limited and then it kept expanding and expanded, and then it got embedded in a wider regional territorial and political context in the first Yugoslavia, second Yugoslavia, decentralization, third Yugoslavia, and so on. So I think a lot of anxiety has inevitably been generated by this lack of stability in terms of territorial boundaries, because if we remember one of the key definitions about nations and nationalism by Benedict Anderson, he talks about the idea of the nation being both imagined but also inherently limited. So every nation is limited. So even in our imagination, we kind of use maps and other symbols to understand and project the idea of the nation. And I think if you look at the history of Serbia, of course, that idea of the limits of the nation is problematic. And I think that's one of the sources that generates anxiety. But I think although this is, I think that I'm not commenting the theoretical contributions because I'm not an expert in IR, but I really think that the framework that Filip developed, I think is very, very useful also for other cases, similar cases of ethno-nationalist conflicts. And actually reading some things about the current events in Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh, I think it's extremely similar. So there is a lot of discourse coming out of Armenia, which in a way tries to express both anxiety for the potential loss of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also it indicates the centrality of the myth of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a recent myth as well. We all know the story of Nagorno-Karabakh, for the very existence of the Armenian nation. So it's quite fascinating. I think there are quite a lot of parallels, and I could see how someone could use Filip's theoretical contribution to analyze a more contemporary case, which is the case of Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh. The other important thing that Filip discusses in his book and develops is this concept of ontic space. And I think it's quite fascinating. And I think the book masterfully explains how, despite of the fact that Kosovo has been de facto part of Serbia for the last almost 100 years, Kosovo has never really become a space of place. So it has remained, so it hasn't become really a physical space. It has remained a social imaginary, a myth. And this is quite remarkable. You understand that today it could serve as such because Serbia has no physical control over Kosovo. But I think it's quite remarkable to see that Kosovo has remained a myth and an ontic space, even at a time when Serbia was de facto controlling Kosovo. So there are other issues which I think are relevant to nationalism and which in a way are touched upon in the book. So one thing which is quite central to the book and to the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia and the centrality of the Kosovo issue in the Serbian nationalist discourse is this relationship between nationalism, religion, and legitimacy. And I think Filip does a good job in kind of bringing issues of nationalism to the fore, but somehow religion is in kind of the backstage, as well as the issue of legitimacy. He talks about the cracks in the Yugoslav system and how that also is related to this idea of critical situations. But also, I think deep down, that's also related to the agency of the Serbian Orthodox Church, which is discussed at length, but not always directly as such. So this relationship, I think, is quite central because at the time when the state was going through turbulent times, when there were issues of state legitimacy, issues of war, insecurity, religion would become a potent force and would in a way find a way to reimpose the myth of Kosovo in the Serbian public discourse, which would then prevail once the situation calms down a bit after the critical situation has somehow been overcome or the situation has normalized. So I think there is an element of the role of religion which could have been potentially discussed in more detail, more directly, but especially connected to the kind of the wider theoretical framework that Filip uses in his work. So a slight criticism that I have about the book is related to the issue of actorness and agency. I'm not talking about the actorness of state as such, but also what I mean here is more about the actorness and agency of different sub-state elements. And primarily here, I mean elites. In some ways, and not always, I think one might get the impression that Filip treats elites as a monolith. And of course, I think it's very rigorous. The analysis is very rigorous, and they are, I think Filip does a great job in analyzing the attitude of different elites at different points in time. But I think generally, because of the way the whole issue has been addressed and positioned and the way the theoretical framework has been developed, I think it, in a way, it's limiting in the sense that there is not enough space to bring the different competitive narratives about the centrality of the issue of Kosovo in the Serbian nationalist discourse. Or in other words, so what were the different streams within the Serbian nationalist movement that fought for their own different understandings of what Serbia means and what does it mean to be part of a Serb nation, or what is the understanding, the different understandings of the Serbian national idea in different decades and different periods in time. So that's the kind of the slight criticism I have. I'm aware, as I'm saying, so I know that he's not intending to treat them as monoliths, and the book speaks for itself, but I thought it could have been, I think there was more space to discuss it different, or at least to frame them more clearly in the context of the different periods in time. The last two brief points. So I think Filip rightly argues that Kosovo as an ontic space is in flux. And I think probably that's one of the main takeaways of the book. So I have a question which is very empirical and related to the current developments in Serbia. Has Vučić's idea of territorial demarcation or razgraničenje had any impact in changing the way the Kosovo as an ontic space in the Serbian nationalist discourse? Because to me, it seems that basically floating this idea that Serbia has to get something in return to avoid humiliation if Serbia is to agree to a final agreement with Kosovo is indicating an important historical process here. The fact that Kosovo has gone a long way to from being the heart of Serbia, the cradle of Serbian nationhood, to becoming a floating signifier today, in the sense that the whole idea of the territory of Kosovo is reduced to northern Kosovo, which is the least significant territorial part of Kosovo in the context of the of the historical myth about the Battle of Kosovo and Kosovo as such. So I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Gizim. I would now make a small change in the order because I think the comment of Sasha Pavlovich is following very much what Gizim is already has already said. So I would just give the floor to him.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, okay. So I see this as a truly heretical book, insofar as it departs heavily from the constructivist outlook that we're all so accustomed with. So I'll deal with its author as a heretic, and in a way that heretics are dealt usually is try to burn him on the stake. Of course, I'm joking. I subscribe fully to appraisals to Filip from Leah and Gazim and others for the way he writes and the way he develops his arguments. I have only one question, though posed in a slightly longer way. It's essentially about the ontological security theory itself. So what is it that I see as anti-constructivist and perhaps even heretical? In very simple terms, this theory, not only that it doesn't approach state and implicitly or by extension the nation as imagined and constructed, it actually treats the state as an agent with a sense of the self. So it's not just that it doesn't proclaim the withering away of the state like emancipatory left or the policy of distancing from the state as many progressive thinkers do. It actually personifies and reaffirms it. So that's why I believe this ontological security theory should be taken seriously and properly tested to see if it brings something fundamentally new to this debate. Now, mutatis mutandis, I think the main argument of the book goes like this. Serbia's irrational behavior in refusing to recognize Kosovo independence can be understood properly when we consider Serbia as a collective agent that clings to Kosovo as its ontic space in order to preserve its sense of the self. And this is certainly a new approach and a new argument. And as I said, it brings an addition to the whole debate. Now, is that what is new also good? I don't know if you know the Beethoven anecdote. Just give me a minute. Like, the anecdote says that a young Viennese composer asked for a reception by Beethoven, and Beethoven admitted him, and then he played some of his works to him and asked him about his opinion. And Beethoven said, well, there is a lot of good and new in your work. And the composer said, oh, I'm overwhelmed by such a high praise coming from you. And the Beethoven, however, replied, what's good is not new, and what's new is not good. So let me approach this main argument in this light. This book makes a compelling case why Kosovo became and still is a sort of mythical ontic space, and how this notion has been perpetuated in Serbian political and even religious and public discourse. But to some extent, I think from earlier studies by Cholovic, and we can go on from folkloristic or ethnographic studies, we knew already that there is a Kosovo myth, that it's foundational as a national and even political and state narrative. Of course, not in the way and in a particular focus that Filip makes. That's of course not the essence of my question. Now, regarding the novelty of the main argument, I could make two principal claims. Stronger claim would be that this new OST explanation is necessary or essential for the understanding of the Kosovo issue, and that one cannot understand the problem without it. And a weaker claim would be that this theory offers one possible alternative explanation of the whole issue, which could be taken as a supplement to the debate. And that's basically my one question for the author. Do you see this approach as essential or as alternative and supplementary one? And just to finish with the two clarifications. First, what do we gain when we personify the state? In your book, I think you offer many statements, some of which come from ruling politicians in power. As you said, you narrowed it down. But when you follow the Kosovo case in history, when you, sorry, just a second. But you also offer some statements from coming from the opposition or from religious figures or from prominent public figures and the like. And strictly speaking, only those coming from the politicians in power can be considered as pertaining to the state. So why do we need this state as collective agency? Can we interpret all these actions maybe as stemming from the concept of the nation and still relevant nationalism to explain Serbia's defiance to Kosovo independence? So do we actually have in the old model of nationalism and the nation as an organism body which can effectively explain why both ruling politicians and opposition leaders and all other agents speak and behave as they do? Why introduce a new level of the state as the self? Can we cut the middleman? And secondly, I assumed that your argument hinges on irrationality of Serbia's behavior towards Kosovo. And indeed, if we cannot understand such behavior, we need to introduce a new concept. But can we not understand this behavior equally well without treating it as irrational? For one thing, you yourself quote one of Koštunica's statements, and Koštunica is really essential for your case, and his statements totally fit the profile. I'm not arguing that. But one of his statements says that you quote, Serbia was requested something that no other country would ever be ready to give unless it wanted to lose its statehood, its identity, and its place among the peoples and nations. And so is it not true? What country ever recognizes voluntarily the loss of its territory? Do we need to go into ontic and ontology discussion about Cyprus or the Falkland Islands, or we could find other cases? And more importantly, isn't the most plausible and easiest explanation the one that considers that Kosovo issue has been resolved in 1999 by an ambiguous, unclear resolution, and that Serbia's behavior is the result of that? You show how Kosovo became a substitute for Bosnia in Serbian nationalist discourse in the late 19th century. So one can say that Bosnia was ontic space before, and perhaps even remained that to some extent. But let us just imagine that tables are reversed and that Kosovo has been resolved in a Dayton-style, comprehensive agreement, clear, whereas Bosnia functions under sort of 1244 resolution. I think your model says that things would still be the same, whereas for the sake of argument, I could claim that we would see in that reverse situation, Kosovo being far less present in the political discourse and Bosnia being on top. And this is my final sentence. Why is this behavior necessarily irrational? When you claim studies did, we want both Kosovo and Europe. You want to attract as many voters as possible. You want to send a message to your voters that you want Serbia to do well in the future, but also to respect its past. Now, whether that's achievable under the circumstances is another issue. And we can easily say, of course, it's not achievable, but it's politically useful and politically not at all irrational, perhaps. So that would be, the flux of my question. How do you see the fundamental value of this theory to this case? Is it essential or is it a supplementary one? And, you know, did I push too far in making this into an example of kind of Occam's razor? Are there simpler explanations to the issue in question? Okay, and thank you for you know, really laying out this wonderful argument in your book.
Thanks, Sasha. So, Filip, a lot of things to tackle.
Take them all, although I'm definitely not going to be able to give them the due attention and depth. First of all, Gezim, thanks, great points. The first one was whether anxiety was stemming in Serbia from this lack of finalité politique, in a way, due to the fact that the borders were changing and expanding in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. To an extent, I agree with you. And I think that, for instance, the EU's anxiety is also stemming from the lack of clear borders. But on the other hand, this is how empires basically function. Like one of the definitions of empires is that they don't have clear borders. They have frontiers which are moving back and forth. Serbia obviously was not an empire in the 19th century, but it did inherit an imperial mindset in the 19th century, if you will. And I explain this in another book, which I've edited, Memories of Empire, the entry of European states into international society, in which, in my chapter in particular, I show that Serbia's nation builders of the early 19th century actually had this and cultivated this memory of medieval Serbian polity, which was also an empire during the reign of Stefan Dušan. Which was essentially different from the mindset of sovereign states. And there I drew on the work of Ivor Neumann. Imperial polities see themselves as being at the center of the world, if you will, and don't see international relations as an anarchical, but rather as a hierarchical place. And Serbia's nation builders actually, and this is shown very well in Čertanije and in many other documents of the 19th century, actually saw Serbia as the rejuvenation of the Serbian empire that needs to expand and put itself into some sort of center of the regional order. That's one point. And another point is that in the 19th century, in the second half and the beginning of the 20th century, the name of the game in international society for nation states was also to expand. If you wanted to really be a respectable member of international society, you needed to have some space where you would kind of expand economically or politically or militarily. And Shogo Suzuki shows that brilliantly in his study of Japan's entry into international society. Basically, Japan emulated European powers when they did what they did in Manchuria and other parts of Asia. And Serbia similarly wanted to kind of be like other European states and, you know, maybe not have its colonies, but to have its East where it could, you know, expand a little bit. And since Bosnia was not any longer in the cards after the Congress of Berlin, as I show in the book, Kosovo, you know, turned out to be the old Serbia, very, you know, fertile ground for that sort of project, which was part and parcel, I think, of the Serbia's entry into European society of state. So it was a source of you know, self-identity and pride and, you know, sense of honor and belonging. But then when Yugoslavia started to shrink and Serbia started to shrink, when the border started to close in, And when Serbia became like Nokia, that was one of the jokes. Now kids don't understand it, and people younger, because now the phones are, you know, getting bigger and bigger. But at one point, the whole point of modernization was that phones were getting smaller and smaller. Nokias were getting smaller and smaller. And one of the prevailing jokes in Serbia was that this is a similarity between Serbia and Nokia. They're getting smaller and smaller all the time. And this was a source of incredible anxiety. And Serbia has been coping with shrinking since the beginning of the Yugoslav crisis, and is still coping with this anxiety from shrinking, from getting smaller, and this angst that the country is going to dismember, that Sanjak will lead tomorrow, and Vojvodina, and will, you know, end up as you know, Belgradski Pašaluk. That's the worst fear of the Serbian nationalists. I fully agree that I didn't, you know, deal properly with religion, and I couldn't. I just gave a few hints, and I inserted into an analysis in few critical moments how the role of Serbian Orthodox Church affected the whole process. And I think it's the essential part of the story, because from the point of view of the Serbian Orthodox Church, Kosovo is theophany, moment when the only moment in the entire Serbian history when God spoke directly to the people. It's comparable to what happened in the you know, Mount Sinai with Moses and the Ten Commandments. It's the moment when heavens opened and when Serbs were, you know, offered by God heavenly kingdom. So it's this central moment in the entire Serbian history from the point of view of the church. And the church is propelling this, you know, mythologized, religion-infused narrative, which is then feeding other nationalist conceptions of the self and of Kosovo. Without the religion, without the role of the Serbian Orthodox Church, I think it would be way easier to deconstruct this narrative. Take a look at Karelia. Karelia is a historic region which used to belong to Finland, which is tightly connected to Kalevala myths and stories of origin, so on and so forth. But after the Second World War, Finland managed to deconstruct this myth. Why? Because it was easy to simply shut down various nationalist organizations which propelled this. They didn't have to shut down the Finnish, you know, church, or to kind of silence such an important actor. And nobody has social capital currently in Serbia to do so with the Serbian Orthodox Church, or you know, take the church head on when it comes to Kosovo. Politicians are either silent, or they simply bandwagon with the dominant religious narratives, which is part of the problem. I agree. My narrative is treating somewhat, you know, state as a monolith. I tried to explain it in the previous response. It's an analytical choice. I wanted to, you know, zoom in on the dominant narratives, and I fully agree. I mean, if I will write a sequel to this book, it will be a book about alternative, marginal discourses to show how they challenge continuously the dominant narrative. But then the question would still be, why haven't they achieved to undermine this narrative after so many years? And then I would have to return to the previous book for argumentations. Or maybe the analysis of you know, strategies of marginal discourses might also shed light. Maybe simply their strategies and tactics haven't been you know, effective enough, which is something that the empirical analysis would have to show. Okay, Alexander, thanks a lot again for a bunch of you know, really difficult and challenging comments. I don't have the time. I don't want to pretend that I have answers to all of them. I will just simply pick up a few. Do I think that this approach is essential or supplementary? I think it's very important, if not the most important answer to why Serbia is attached to Kosovo. There are other, you know, factors and important, you know, variables to look at. For instance, I haven't touched upon economy. From Dimitrije Tucovic until today, there is this line of, reasoning that, economic reasons were extremely important why Serbia wanted to expand to the old Serbia. It needed markets. So it's a sort of imperial, extension or colonial, if you will. So Serbia it couldn't colonize, other territories, but it needed new markets and new people to sell goods to. And it also needed the pathway to the Adriatic Sea in order to avoid the blockade imposed by Austro-Hungarian Empire. So economic analysis is certainly important. I sidelined it, but I don't think it's the key explanatory variable. I think the identity, narratives and collective memories and ontological security is, in my view, an explanation which does a better job than the others. It also does a better job than the realist sort of analysis, which would say, just like you suggested at the very end, well, isn't it the case that every state is protecting its territorial integrity? Do we really need ontic spaces and ontological security? Tell me a country which has ever recognized, part of its territory which seceded. There are so many examples. I mean, I know that each example will be challenged, that it's not really an example, but one which comes to mind first is France and Algeria. Algeria was, integral part of the French state. It was not a colony. It was integrated administratively within France. And Algeria spent more time in French Empire than Kosovo in Serbia, for that matter, if you take the number of years. And Algeria was incredibly important for the French, sense of self, dignity, and everything. Also for the identity of Pieds Noirs and people who lived there. And France came to terms with the loss of Algeria. Other examples: Finland and Karelia. Finland lost Karelia to Soviet Union and came to terms with it and accepted after, obviously, the war. And Serbia also lost the war, but it didn't, for some reasons that I try to explain, come to terms with the loss of Kosovo. You will maybe say, okay, maybe Karelia is not a good example because it's not well known and it wasn't that important for the Finnish identity. Kalevala, it's a minor, story. How about Germany and Prussia? I mean, Germany was, historically united around Prussia, which was, located in parts of Europe which today don't belong to Germany. And nobody in their right mind in Germany, even the stringiest of nationalists, the biggest, the most vitriolic ones, do not suggest for Germany to reclaim territories which today belong to, Poland or other countries to the east. And there are many other examples. Take Denmark and Greenland and really, really other examples which abound in modern history, which show that, yes, states come to terms with the loss of territory, and this is not something so unusual as the Serbian nationalists try to portray it, and Vojislav Koštunica in his speeches. Finally, let me just take the issue of personification of the state and the treatment of state as a person, or to anthropomorphize the state. And a couple of people have raised this issue, and this is luckily for me, I would say, something which has been, analyzed and discussed quite intensely over the years in the literature. And for me, a relatively easy task is just to, take the arguments which have, the counter arguments which have already been, mobilized against this charge. One is that politicians treat states as persons all the time. They do it on a daily basis. How many times did you hear President of Serbia saying Serbia will not allow to be humiliated, or Serbia is a proud state, or Serbia thinks this or that, or simply in their people and politicians and wider population treat states as persons, as if they were persons, and make decisions as if states were persons. And on a daily basis, they simply attribute human-like qualities and emotions to states. And the fact that they behave as if states were persons is a sociological insight, which then we have to bring on board and maybe as social scientists see what kind of effects does it have on the world. Second argument in favor of anthropomorphization of the state and not focusing on individuals, but rather on collective agents, is that it really helps us understand some macro-political dynamics. It's a good heuristics. I do not say that state is a person, but conceptualizing state as a person for the above mentioned reasons is helping me to understand certain dynamics and behavior of actors. And finally, the third and also an important argument is that states are run by people, by individual people who identify with the state and also share emotions with the state. They feel personally humiliated if they think that the state is humiliated, or they feel personally anxious or proud if their collective, especially whom they represent, is treated as such. So given the fact that individuals are running states, then we can apply certain human-like categories to the state and see where the analysis will take us. Obviously, it has downsides, and there are many people in ontological security studies which don't buy this argument, and they only treat individuals. They study individuals rather than corporate agents, but this is a debate within ontological security studies. I am taking this state as a person approach, drawing on the works of from Alex Wendt to Jelena Subotic, and it has its downsides, but as I said, it has its also defenses. Yeah, that would be all. I would have much more to say, but I also want to hear the final speakers. But thank you both for really, really impressive comments and critiques that will further make me think and improve my arguments, certainly in the future.
Yes, a lot of material for a second book, Filip. And now I would like to give the floor to Agon, who is joining us from Pristina, and I'm particularly interested to see the Kosovo's perspective, Albanian perspective on this anxiety question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to this very, very interesting event. I really much enjoyed the contributions. I really enjoyed the book. I found it very insightful and very, very interesting and intriguing. A few caveats. I'm having a bit of a cold. I'm not feeling very well, so that impacts the lucidity of my thinking. It's also been a very crazy day of news. Not just globally, but also in Kosovo, as you've probably heard. The third thing, I just being, it's also kind of almost intimidating, I would say, being the only non-academic here, someone who's abandoned academia 10 years ago. There's a bit of an imposter syndrome element going on here. But as a practitioner, as somebody who also engages deeply with ideas and theories, I think I could also contribute some comments, although possibly imprecise sometimes in terms of categorization or concepts, because I have been out of academia for a long time. So what I thought when I was asked to talk here, I thought what could be my added value. I could not review or comment this from any sort of theoretical perspective, whether from the field of nationalism or IR or politics, nor am I that much of an expert on Serbia to question any kind of elements. So what I thought I could, what the book thought provoked me to do is to kind of, think about the flip side of the story of Kosovo on the Kosovo Albanian side. Because I really found this ontological security kind of framework useful. This was the first time I was introduced to it. As I said, I'm not in academia, so I found it very, very interesting because as someone who's been trying to, because of global developments, going back to realist reading a lot, and I always find it a bit dry and insufficiently convincing for a lot of explanations of motivations of state. This came out to me as very refreshing. It almost felt like a decade ago when I discovered behavioral economics and how it helped, kind of unravel and put into question all this rational choice and all these things in economics. This idea of psychology and treating states as persons. I fully agree with what Filip now just recently also kind of the line of reasoning of why we should look at that psychological dimension and can treat states, or at least that dominant narrative. They're not monolithic, but there is a dominant narrative, and it's almost equally important, or even more important than factors like political economy and or things that the realists look like interests. And so the book helped me understand Serbia, but it gave me this framework. And the central subject of the discussion is, the question Filip asks is, and the question a lot of people in the world have asked is, why is Serbia's behavior so irrational? So, for many years, the expectations in many liberal corners of the West and in Kosovo was, that Serbia will simply one day accept reality of Kosovo's independence. And Serbia's position and motivation seem indeed hard to explain from, it seemed irrational. So I think by focusing on sort of, this ontological, looking at it from this from prism of ontological security, I think we get to these answers. And, first of all, the history is very well written, the historical account, why the myth became so central. And the end, ultimately, the argument is a bit structural, I guess. The obstacle created by this history is now too big for agency or elites to change. But I think what at this point it's important to note is that while Serbia, has been seen as irrationally acting as a state, in a world that is now increasingly more receptive to nationalism and where there's more skepticism toward multilateralism and liberalism and the kind of assumptions of the 90s and early 2000s, it's also important to know that Serbia's position is no longer seen as that irrational, in a more nationalistic world. So by sticking with this irrational policy for 20 years, it kind of went now for full circle. And, and I think now in this new kind of world, not many now actually accept that or expect that Serbia will recognize Kosovo just like that. So now we've come to a point where there's this other idea that has been normalized, that Serbia has to get something for that recognition, and there's increasingly some voices saying that okay, now Kosovo has to give something. And increasingly, Kosovo is now seen sometimes as irrational. Like why is Kosovo now so rigid in its position and not willing to make any concession? And that position is sometimes also viewed as irrational. So I try to look at maybe at least use this framework to at least identify 3 or 4 sources of anxiety on why, what are the sources of anxiety in Kosovo, on why Kosovo's positions are so rigid. This whole idea that we need to protect a sense of self, a biological narrative. Now, Gazim mentioned earlier here this this issue that nations, this Kosovo as a new state, is marked by a high sense of insecurity about itself. When and where is a nation? Gazim said. We already are marked by a lot of these insecurities. So first, I think people around the region in Serbia as well, but globally as well, forget that 2008 in Kosovo was not experienced just as a victory. Yes, of course, there was a lot of jubilation, excitement, but it was also a very traumatic event in the sense that it sparked an identity crisis in Kosovo. The whole Ahtisaari state, the model of the state, which neglects everything related to history, to Albanian identity, was experienced very, very traumatically. And I remember it was February 17, 2008, when the independence was declared, and somebody came into the cafe we were hanging out, and with a Kosovo flag, and said, "This is our flag," and they were like, "Yeah," So can you imagine the moment where you're celebrating, but something comes in there as a symbol that you don't even recognize? And we spent a decade trying to sort of internalize the new identity and the limitations that came with Ahtisaari. No unification with Albania, minority veto rights, all these things caused a big identity crisis and a belief and a feeling that Kosovo has already given too much, in a way, also a sense of itself. And this traumatic experience explains a lot of the domestic problems we've had in Kosovo, and a lot of the, especially also in the dialogue with Serbia. So now, 10 years later, when somebody comes and says, you have to give even more, it almost becomes, but we already gave ourselves, So, what more can we give? This is the, there's this fear of this total sort of loss of subjectivity and identity and biographical kind of, this narrative of being Albanians. The second source, then it's kind of ironically and paradoxical that while we were facing this insecurity about, loss of, or fear of loss of Albanian identity, there was also an emergence and growth of Kosovo-centric feeling as well. So when this idea of border changes sort of started when it emerged, one of the harshest reactions against it, came from this more Kosovo-centric, this fear that Kosovo, if there is this sort of partition or idea of border changes, what does it mean for Kosovo as a state? Does Kosovo survive as a state? Even fears of unification with Albania. This is not sometimes discussed maybe enough in the region. There is a strong streak of Kosovo-centric beliefs in Kosovo. And we've noticed in the past year or two, actually, a reduction in the percentage of people who say they want to unify with Albania. So there's this now this idea after 10 years or 12 years, the idea of Kosovo identity has strengthened. And there was also, so strong reaction against any idea of border changes because of fear and anxiety that, among those who want to preserve Kosovo as a state, that would mean the end of the state. The third sort of issue or big source of anxiety is, it relates to the issue of the story, our state biography as victims of aggression and what in Kosovo is seen as, a history of colonial behavior of Serbia. So, the idea that we were victims and Serbia was the aggressor, and now it's kind of also overlapping with this idea of the special chambers for war crimes, where 20 years later, those who fought for Kosovo's liberation are now being treated or sort of being treated as war criminals. This whole narrative, the way the narrative is kind of twisting, is becoming very traumatic. So the idea that now Kosovo has to give something in return is seen as so unfair and so puts into question this identity of Kosovo as a state and as a victim of aggression that has to now give something to its aggressor, that it becomes such a stumbling block for any discussion for a compromise or anything else. So some might view it as irrational, this approach in Kosovo. Yes, indeed, Kosovo is losing a lot from its current positions or foreign policy kind of stance. It's international isolation and all these things. So you would assume that somebody would say, well, we need to do something about it. So let's. But I think all of these factors, these psychological factors, are so overwhelming. That's why I found the framework to be very useful and kind of now amateurishly, and speculatively, try to kind of identify a few sort of sources that, our master narrative and how, and what are our sources of anxiety that are putting us in this deadlock. And I would conclude by saying that, reading Filip's book and, listening to what I kind of outlined here, I think the practical implication of this is that, is that we are really stuck in this very these are very deeply structural forces that are, if they are as powerful as we are saying, then, the fear is that, there will be no solution, at least in the foreseeable future. So, and what's the space for agency there? It's a more elaborate and a different discussion, I guess. So I will end here. I know my contribution is not necessarily, like academic, or I don't have maybe questions. I just wanted to kind of highlight that, this framework is useful. As Jelena Subotić said in the beginning, it's applicable to various contexts. And it certainly, I think, is applicable to the flip side of Filip's book. So thanks.
Thanks a lot, Agon. And the final speaker for tonight, my colleague Vladimir.
Thank you very much. Greetings to everyone. I would like to say at the outset that we have in front of us a very valuable book, not only due to its theoretical contribution and the questions it has raised, but also due to the impact it may have on security issues and its practical application to the problem of Kosovo. As a non-expert in security studies, I'm not competent to comment on theoretical contribution of this book. The four arguments about the attribution of human needs and the motion to states, ontological security umbrella, macro-level patterns of state behavior, and treatment of states as represented by people seem to me quite convincing. My focus will be on representation of Kosovo as Serbia's ontic space and its construction on the basis of Kosovo myth, or on the second and third chapters of this book. Since I'm particularly interested with the question of Serbian collective identity connected to Kosovo or Kosovo myth, the issue of identity that author tackles in chapter 1 as a mathematical rather than philosophical problem might need some elaboration. By considering the identity by proposition A is equal A and overlooking other mainly Christian attempts originally initiated by Augustine to establish the individual and collective identity on proposition A is equal non-A, author perceives an individual loss, a sense of continuity and coherence as an identity crisis. This establishes identity as a monolithic and static issue, while according to Pierre Nora, individual and collective identities may also be perceived as continuity of discontinuities. This approach towards Kosovo as Serbian ontic space is recently taken by Serbian historian Miloš Ković. In this respect, the author rightly employs Soren Kierkegaard's focus on anxiety stemming from dizziness of freedom, but does not make use of Kierkegaard's view on sacrifice as constitutive for identity. In regard to the chapters dealing with the construction of Kosovo as Serbian ontic space, the author places the beginning of this process in 1970s due to a particular set of changing geopolitical circumstances in Central Europe. It is very important to notice that by identifying the beginning of this process with international recognition of the Serbian state, author links Kosovo as ontic space to the Serbian state, although Kosovo was already for almost 5 centuries in the collective memory of the Serbian church. The sacralized narrative about Kosovo battle of Serbian army against the Ottoman Empire at the Kosovo field appears in the process that has evolved over time, not as determination for a heavenly kingdom, which the Serbian church has cherished, but as the catastrophic defeat of Serbian forces. Thus, the Serbian state ideology completely misses the metaphorical and metaphysical and eschatological perspective, which is in the foundation of the Kosovo Testament, replacing it with a narrative about Kosovo as cradle of the nation. Therefore, it should be stated that we deal with 2 parallel processes, one based on Kosovo legend or myth, and its symbolic importance for the nation building. And the second one understood as a Kosovo Testament or Kosovo Covenant, which has its ecclesial importance for the organization of dispersed jurisdictions of the Serbian Church. It is true that for the most part of the 19th century, Serbia did not have any territorial aspiration toward Kosovo, but the Serbian Church, with its two ecclesial jurisdictions, tended to free itself from imperial hegemony of Kaiser and ecclesial hegemony of Constantinople, and to regain its dioceses. Milica Bakic-Hayden pointed out that interplay between the so-called myth of Kosovo and the true history of Kosovo could give much better view on the Kosovo problematic than the attempts to distinguish between these two. However, it seems to me that the Kosovo Testament is here replaced with the Kosovo myth as secularized, profane, and more politically applicable self. When it comes to Yugoslav period, this is valuable author's analysis of Kosovo as Yugoslav ontic space. I would like to point to another important identity marker for Serbian Church. It is the concept of Svetosavlje or Saint Sabbathhood. Similarly to Kosovo myth as identity marker, this concept is equally applied to the process of liberation of the Serbian state and church from the Ottomans and Austro-Hungarians, as much as for the building of Yugoslav state and Yugoslav collective identity. This is very much present in the church authors such as Nikolai Velimirovic, to whose work from 1939 author refers. However, there is a line of religious writers beginning from Petar Petrović Njegoš, Nikolai Velimirovic, Justin Popović, Miloš Đurić, over Dimitrije Bogdanović, Atanasije Jeftić, Amfilohije Radović, Žarko Vidović, to previously mentioned Miloš Ković, whose works are revolving around Kosovo Testament, not as identity space of the Serbian state, but rather as identity marker of Serbian Orthodoxy and its distinctive character. The political utilization and instrumentalization of Kosovo Testament or Kosovo myth had various historical forms, and it is, as much as other elusive Christian concepts, more an image filled with different meanings than strictly defined notion. Therefore, it seems to me the second and the third chapter represent the author's attempt to present true story about the Kosovo myth. It is a reception of the reception, and in many aspects, the author relies on Ivan Čolović's account, constructed in opposition to the Kosovo myth construed by the above aforementioned authors, such as Velimirovic, Popović, and maybe Radović. Maybe the arguments of the former are not so much relevant, but the historical sources of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Kosovo might shed some new perspective on contemporary events. In his representation of Kosovo and post-World War II period, as well as modern period, Albanians appear, in my view, mostly as the subjects of the communist maltreatment and the interactive objects of contemporary Serbian Milošević policy. Thus, the genesis of Kosovo Albanian political agenda always appear as conditioned by somebody else's politics and not inspired by their own aspiration, wishes, and political outlooks. This is not a critique I address to author, but I rather observe that every attempt to portray contemporary Kosovo must include Albanian sources as substantial. And I'm very glad to hear Mr. Malici's story here, because I don't know what's going on, and I never heard about this kind of feelings about like a centralized Kosovo feelings. Now, I have a look at three questions. So, like one is theoretical and two are like a contextual. The first, in one of the chapters toward the end, Filip, you apply your theory of existence, finitude, relation, and biography on construction of Kosovo, Serbia, ontic space. This theoretical contribution is very useful, but what puzzles me is the application of your theory not on century long construction of Kosovo as Serbia's ontic space, but only on the period immediately before and after Kosovo declaration of independence. I'm sure that the theoretical framework on these four arguments will work on the whole history of making Kosovo as a ontic space. The second is regarding your treatment like of Kosovo issue after Milosevic. You're like relying on Dubravka Stojanovic and her words that opposition did not criticize Milosevic for using the Kosovo meat as a fuel for his aggressive policies, but on the authenticity of his attachment to Kosovo meat. It means that, and you said that it's interesting to note that most speakers use Kosovo meat to call for more peace and democracy in Serbia. I'm just curious, can you think more about this kind of application of Kosovo meat, not kind of militaristic and aggressive like we had in the past with Milosevic and Secession? Now, because obviously what was happening in Montenegro, it's a Serbian church, suddenly Svetosavlje, which is considered as kind of very negative thing, became like a tool for fight for democratization and respect of human and civil rights. I think that is happening in Kosovo with policy pursued by Sava Janic and some other Kosovo Serbian clerics. And now the third is, obviously the book was finished in a period like 2012, and I presume that you added this material which is later. Then actually it's stand the question of Kosovo independence as a crucial question in Serbian integration to EU. Now, as we can see now, and as I feel as a Serbian citizen in a Serbian parliament, the only representative I can say that it represents my attitudes, it's Shaib Kamberi, Albanian politician from south of Serbia. I don't have problem. This is pretty much the same with Dritan Abazovic. I share the same issue and sample. Can you maybe think of other way of solving this issue, but in independent Kosovo? Just I'm thinking of certain union. Now we have mini Schengen. Maybe in the future, some kind of unification, not just between Kosovo and Albania, but Kosovo, Albania, and Serbian, let's say Macedonia and Montenegro would be the option to resolve our problems. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. So those were two last panelists. Filip, the floor is yours. And then we are going to have just briefly, maybe if you want to answer the questions from the audience, we are going to have a chance.
How much time do I have, Gazela?
We are already over the time, but I guess if everybody agrees, we can stay 15 more minutes. So you can answer these questions, and very briefly, what is...
Sure. Before I move to Agon's and Vladimir's points, which were really, really useful and great, and inspired me a lot, I will try to explain how. I just wanted to come back to 2 points which remained unanswered from the previous round. I've now realized that I've jotted them down, but didn't have a chance to say. One was Alexander's question on originality. What was original? What's new? And this is something which ontological security theory has been faced with, this question. Okay, so we have so many theories in sociology about identity, and from anthropology, various insights about constructedness of the collective self and emotions. What new do you bring to the table? apart from this new language that you mobilize. One of the novelties is coming from the fact that this theory is being developed within international relations. So we translate insights from other disciplines, the disciplines which have, treaded this path more kind of further, that went more further on with the examination of these issues before IR came to the field of identity and identity politics. So we are translating this wealth of insights from various other disciplines, and we construct an argument, a theoretical framework, which stand as an alternative to other paradigms in international relations, such as realism, liberalism, Marxism, so on and so forth. So in a way, it is an eclectic framework which is trying to bring all those issues to the debates, to the fore, or to the mainstream debates within international relations. So theoretically, it's novel in a sense that it bring together elements in a way that haven't been brought before. Social psychology, its focus on emotions and anxiety, with discussions on state interest, state identity, and state agency. In that respect, I think this is theoretically novel, in addition to more kind of refined arguments that Jelena has also pointed out, which come from my own work, materiality and critical situations. But there are many other very interesting development in the field of ontological security studies, and it's a quickly growing field. The second, in terms of empirical analysis, I see the point that many of the arguments which I raise have been, already raised or known, that even Čolović has written about it, and the others. But I think that the new thing is to connect, to show how this whole story about Serbia's obsession with Kosovo is not Serbia's specific. It's not something which is an aberration of a devious Serbian mind, but something which is, comparable to other similar cases, and that states and nations have similar concerns, psychological needs, so on and so forth. They have different empirical political problems, but the theoretical kind of argument can have legs and can travel to other cases. From Kosovo's point of view, as Agon has elaborated, to many more other states that have been analyzed through this theoretical framework, and which makes them universal and comparable. When it comes to the question of irrationality, just quickly, Alexander, you mentioned that I treat Serbia's Kosovo as irrational, but I would, if you approve, like to correct slightly this interpretation. I start from the question that the Serbia's policy towards Kosovo looks like an irrational behavior to an outsider, especially to a Westerner. As Jelena said, many people ask, well, what's the point? Recognize the damn thing and move on. You're irrational. You are acting in a self-harming way. You don't gain anything. You don't seem to have a strategy, but you continuously have this defiant no. We don't want to accept the independence of Kosovo without offering any viable alternatives. And you keep incurring reputational costs, political, economic, so on and so forth. So, and then I explain in the book that despite the fact that it looks like an irrational policy, that there is a rationality to it, that the rationality to it, the rationale behind this policy is the need of the Serbian state, and I'll get back to what is the state again, because Vladimir raised it as well. The state needs a healthy sense of self. It needs to maintain its biographical continuity, its narrative of the self. When this narrative of the self is ruptured and seriously challenged, there is anxiety which is not under full control of the political leaders, because we're talking about sedimented structures. And that's why politicians have a very narrowed set of options that they can pursue, and they're usually conservative, rigid attachment to the narrative. So I try to understand the rationality behind, not to simply disregard it as irrational, which I think in my mind is a liberal myopia that I started my presentation with, to simply say, hi, hey, let's move on from this Kosovo mythology from Middle Ages. Are you crazy? We shall look into the future. I'm simply trying to understand the rationale, to sit in the shoes of the nationalist nation builders and entrepreneurs, if you like, and to understand from their point of view what Kosovo means and why it's so difficult to move on from these rigid narratives. Okay, so now there's a question of, also another question by Gezim, just quickly, has something changed? According to all the opinion polls, Serbs still consider Kosovo to be the heart of Serbia. For instance, there has recently been a research by Center for Social Development and Regional Initiatives. In 2019, 70% of people agree with the statement that Kosovo is heart of Serbia. I think it's probably bigger than the number of people who would agree with the statement at the height of Milosevic's, power 1989, speech at Gasimestan. Probably if you would poll the Serbs in 1989, I wouldn't be surprised if a smaller percentage of people would agree with the assertion that he launched basically in 1989 in Gasimestan. He started his speech on this very place at the heart of Kosovo. I couldn't trace an older usage of this metaphor. Probably there was, but not in the mainstream political discourse. Other questions have similar answers. For instance, recognition of Kosovo is a treason. Do you agree? 70% agree. Serbia wouldn't exist without Kosovo. 60% of Serbs think that Serbia couldn't exist. There would be no Serbia without Kosovo. Similar percentage of people think that Serbia should never recognize Kosovo because it would be, sort of humiliation, so on and so forth. And the polls, opinion polls show time and again very similar results. I remember in 2011 at the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, we did something similar, and it was again 2/3 of people who had such opinions. So it doesn't really change, despite the internal dialogue. It seems to me quite solid. Rock solid. Okay, so now let me move to Agon's points quickly. Agon, thank you so much. I mean, your speech really reminded me about one really fundamental insight into, collective identities, and that is that identities are always relational. And, people tend to forget it, and I sidelined it strategically from the work, and I consider this as it's one of its big weaknesses. But simply, again, for the sake of coherence, I focused on Serbia's part of the equation. And there is also a school, if you want, and it's not a school of thought, but an approach to ontological security, which sees ontological security as, to use the words of Brent Steele, the internal dialectics of the self, as opposed to more relational type of analysis, which is offered by Jennifer Mitzen and many others. So you study how the self reflects about the self. So it's just a mode of analysis instead of focusing on relational dynamics, how different identities constitute each other. This is another side of the equation that could also be, a research strategy. And maybe we can write an essay about it where we see those identities as identities in dialogue, to see how those anxieties are interlocked, as you say, in structural conditions, vicious circle, so to speak, and why they cannot leave this, vicious circle, how they feed each other. And finally, Vladimir, so many extraordinarily, inspiring thoughts. Kierkegaard definitely, and there is now a move within ontological security studies to draw much more on the existentialist scholarship, because it's such a wealth of literature which has been totally ignored by IR scholarship at all. I mean, not only Kierkegaard, but Sartre, and all the others, and Heidegger. This literature is extremely compatible and could be super useful for further development of the whole research agenda. Bahar Rumelili has given a speech at last year's Belgrade CISA conference on it, and me and Jelena are now editing a forum in Journal of International Relations and Development, anxiety and existential turn in IR, so to speak. So thanks a lot. It's a good point. Also, you rightly pointed out that Kosovo myth and Kosovo stories were important for the Serbian collective consciousness, not everywhere equally, but especially among the more educated parts of Serbs who lived in Austro-Hungarian, in Austria and Austro-Hungarian Empire, but also among the church circles. The Kosovo myth and the memory of Kosovo certainly was an important marker of collective identity. But what I try to argue is that it became a territorial aspiration, and in a way it became a political or territorial myth after the Berlin Congress and Austria's and Habsburg's push of Serbia out of Bosnia. This is a context where I situate the birth of Kosovo as a territorial myth, the birth of this aspiration to expand to Kosovo. It's just, historical, identification of the context in which this story about Kosovo became attached to the aspiration to include the territory of the sacred space in Serbia. The same could be said, for instance, for Jerusalem in the Zionist narrative. Yes, Jews used to say, to each other, next year in Jerusalem for 2,000 years. But that next year in Jerusalem didn't mean next year we are going to have Jerusalem as our capital. This is something which happened with the Zionist movement. Next year in Jerusalem, for much of the history, meant next year we're going to be pilgrims and see each other in Jerusalem, but then we're going to go back to wherever we live. But then this story, this vow to have Jerusalem, to see next year in Jerusalem, became a territorial aspiration only with the modern Zionist national narrative from 19th century onwards. What is the difference and the distinction between state and nation? You're totally right. It's more about the nation than about the state, right? And I fully agree. And there's some works in ontological security studies which overly focus on state. And I try to redress this by showing how state and nation are, interlocked, or how they're polities which are embedded in each other. So think of babushka, right? You have state, or nation, and then within nation you have a state. You can have the national consciousness without state, but the national consciousness is vying to have a state. That's the whole point of a national consciousness. So the two are inextricably linked. And also, what is a state without nation? It's like a pure administrative institution without life, so to speak, without identity, without corporate interest. And it's difficult to attribute to human-like emotions because people don't identify with such a state. Take, I don't know, Bosnia and Herzegovina as an example for the Bosnian Serbs. Yes, and finally, can Kosovo myth and Kosovo legends be used for progressive purposes. I gave a few examples. As I said previously, I didn't study that much or at all, almost alternative discourses. I gave here and there maybe some minor examples, but definitely this stayed outside of my radar. I'm sure that there are more examples, and even if there are no many examples, it shouldn't stop us and prevent us from thinking creatively how the Kosovo storyline could open up space for more progressive or forward-looking, peace-loving, democracy-building any political project. And I think this is a better way of approaching this problem than simply discarding everything that has to do with Kosovo as some remnant of past age and some vitriolic nationalist script that needs to be discarded altogether. I think the only way to go is to try to redefine the whole, Vidovdanski Zavet and Kosovo myth and Kosovo legend in this direction. In the direction of coexistence, in the direction of peace building, in the direction of emancipation, social or political or any other. But it's a project that hasn't even started.
Thanks, Filip. Well, I think we had a great discussion with a lot of things opened, a lot of answered. Some of the people already left us. I tried to respond to a few of the questions, especially where to find the book. It's Palgrave edition, so you can find it on Palgrave website. And there are 3 more questions. I think 2 of them relate to something which is not the topic of this book, and in general not related directly to this. This is the controversy of the legality of the secession of Kosovo in legal terms. I don't think that we have time and space and also experts to answer this. Another question is about role of the United States in the matter, and also the role of or perception of Serb displaced people from Kosovo. I don't know if you want to answer any of these, Filip, or we can close here, because I think this is something which is very specific and a little bit outside of the general discussion, but I mean, if you want.
Yeah, but just briefly, as you said, it's not questions that we have discussed
yes,
during the past
exactly.
2.5 hours. I really apologize. It's been a very long panel. I don't know if the world has changed. Who won in the presidential elections? I mean, what the hell is going on outside? I was following closely, and now we're all in the Kosovo story. But just for a few more minutes, legality of secession of Kosovo. From the point of view of international law, I think secessions are not legal in international law in general if they're unilateral. But on the other hand, it's a much more complex issue, because on the other hand, you have other rules of international law which could apply, like the right of people to self-determination, right? So it's not such an easy, obviously such an easy question, but as you know, the ICJ, one of the bodies which is mandated to provide the answers to this question, basically shirked or avoided to answer directly the question whether secession is illegal. Although the question itself was not asked in such a way. The question itself that Serbia asked the General Assembly of the United Nations to ask the ICJ was whether the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo contravenes international law. And what the court answered was that international law does not have any provisions on the unilateral declarations of independence, which means that if now the 30-something of us would declare the independence of Belgrade from Serbia, that wouldn't contravene international law, because the declaration itself is not illegal. But the secession itself, against the will of the capital, if there are no other elements which would justify, such as the right of people to on self-determination would be, I think, seen as, against international law, against some founding kind of documents such as the Charter, the UN Charter, or the Helsinki Final Act. How do I see the role of the United States? Obviously, United States of America has been one of the leading nations in NATO in 1999, and also one of the sponsors of Kosovo independence, and the country which is seen as crucial from the Serbian nationalist point of view for the creation of independent state of Kosovo. And I even give some interesting examples in the book when Koštunica was basically saying that the new battle of Kosovo is now being fought, but instead of the Ottoman Empire, we have one great power of the time, which was unjust and encroaching on the Serbian interests. We have another one, which is the United States. And again, like in the past, we are small, but we are defiant and we will prevail. So you have this metamorphosis of Serbian enemies from the Ottoman Empire through Habsburgs to Germans and the Americans throughout history. But this is, again, something which exists in other national imaginaries. And for example, the Jews, from the Bible era enemies through the Germans to Palestinians and Iranians. It's the similar discourse, as if it was one enemy which is shape-shifting through history. And there are very often comparisons between Ahmadinejad and Hitler and, I don't know, Persian Tsars. Finally, if I remember correctly, I think the book did not include so many details about Serb displaced people from Kosovo. Do you consider the existence important? I think it's very important. Kosovo Serbs play a very important role in my history because I showed that they were one of the three main actors in the 1980s who propelled this narrative of, Albanization of the province, of the victimization of the Serbian Christians and Serbs in Kosovo, and who were really, they started their mobilization independent from the regime. Contrary to what usually political scientists in the West think, that Milosevic instrumentalized Kosovo Serbs, I fully agree with the Nebojša Vladislavović book, on which I've really built my understanding of the context, which basically argues that their mobilization of the Kosovo Serbs in the 1980s was autonomous and bottom-up, and really was co-opted by Milosevic from 1987 onwards. And later on, displacement of the Kosovo Serb community did not play that much of a role in my book, but I've recently written, and it's going to come out very soon, in Cooperation and Conflict, an article where I do take into consideration the reverse ethnic cleansing, if you will, and the expulsion of Kosovo Serbs from Pristina, or they're leaving after 1999 under pressure, and how it plays out in Kosovo Albanian understanding of the unfinished church in downtown Pristina. But I don't want to give more spoilers. Take a look at the Cooperation and Conflict very soon. And I apply the same theoretical framework, by the way. So I think I've covered most points which were asked. Thank you very much, everyone, for really inspiring, quite long but really thought-provoking discussion. I learned a lot. You made me slightly anxious and ontologically insecure about my book, but I hope that it will open up space for creative agency on my side and improvement and better work in the future.
Thanks a lot, all panelists, from my side also for accepting this invitation. This was really important to have as a discussion about, I would say, very urgent societal issues are very important to the Institute. Thanks once more to Filip for accepting this. I know that he is recovering from COVID and this was a long event. I hope that you are going to be fine after it. So thank you all once more, and also to attendees for joining us tonight. I hope that we are going to see each other at some proximate place and time soon. All the best to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Get well, Filip.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Bye.